Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. We're just waiting for everybody to join. As we're entering, I do ask that everybody keeps themselves on mute just to avoid audio feedback. All right, I'd say we're just about ready to begin. So hello everyone, and welcome to the third and final session in this series of bringing a neuro-inclusive lens to housing. My name is Nathika. I'm the education programmer at BC and PHA, and we're joined today again by our lovely speakers, Mike and Margaret from Carleton University. Um, as usual, a little bit of housekeeping. While you're present in this session, we'd like to request everybody to stay on mute. If you do have any questions, please feel free to either raise your hand or ask them to us via the chat on your right-hand side, and we'll do our best to facilitate you. Again, we encourage everybody to participate throughout the session in the way that it best suits you. So whether it's by speaking or by typing in, we're happy to support you either way. And before we officially begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded Coast Salish territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. Our work at BC Nonprofit Housing takes place throughout the ancestral and unceded territories of about 198 distinct First Nations in BC. We'd like to recognize the enduring presence and resilience of Indigenous peoples in these lands and express our humble gratitude for the opportunity to live, learn, and work here. We'd also like to pay our respects to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples joining us here today. I'd also like to welcome everybody to say hello in the chat and let us know which territory you're engaging from today. And with that, I'll pass it over to Mike and Margaret to get us started on the session.
Thanks so much, Natika, and welcome everybody. And so we're really excited to be here today and to be bringing to you our third part of our three-part series. Of course, you are more than welcome to be here if you haven't been here for the last two, as we'll be doing a brief overview of what we've gone over before. Today, we're really thinking about reflection, ideation, and advocacy. And we're going to be doing some scenarios, so we're going to ask you to get involved today. Next slide, please, Mike. So as Natka did a land acknowledgement, we also wanted to do a land acknowledgement to acknowledge that our team is committed to making housing more equitable and welcoming for everybody on Turtle Island. And we recognize the importance of acknowledging the land that our work takes place on. So our work spans across Turtle Island, and we intentionally and thoughtfully ground our efforts within the lands, now known as Canada, and offer gratitude to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities whose territories that we occupy. Our project is based from Carleton University, and we acknowledge that the university is situated on Algonquin territory. We know that land acknowledgements are only a starting point, and we recognize our responsibility to actively work towards dismantling colonialism and white supremacy, and we commit to ongoing learning and meaningful action to address the lasting impacts of colonialism in Canada. So today, as we talk to you about reflection, ideation, and advocacy, we encourage you to think about how we can use reflection, ideation, and advocacy as ways to work towards conciliation through inclusive and accessible housing solutions. Next slide, please, Mike. So my name is Margaret Ann van Rensburg, and I'm the Community Outreach Liaison for the Neuroinclusive in Housing Project at Carleton. And for those of you who would benefit from a visual description, I'm a white blonde woman. I am wearing kind of zipped up black jacket, and my hair is in a messy bun. I'm really excited to be here today. And I'm going to ask my colleague Mike to introduce himself and our team.
Hi everyone, I'm Mike Chong. I am the knowledge mobilization lead for our project here. And our additional team members, we have Boris and Tara as our project leads, Katie, our project manager, Oksana, our research lead, and Taylor, our research assistant. I'll also share a little bit about myself, as I did with the other webinars. I am Chinese Canadian, in my 30s, short black hair still. And I'm wearing dark-rimmed black glasses. I go by the pronouns he and him, and today I am in a V-neck light purple sweater.
Thanks so much, Mike. I'll ask you to switch slides. So we really encourage you to be involved today, and that's why we include an icebreaker. So please write in the chat who you are, where you are tuning into this webinar from, and you can also write in the chat, is a taco a sandwich? You can also write a spicy comment about why you think it is or is not. And this time I may even let you know what I think. Okay, next slide, please, Mike. So today, Mike will start with a recap of the key takeaways from our last two sessions, ensuring that everybody is up to speed where we are. Then he'll lead us into a brief reflection on what housing success means. After, we will ideate using a scenario where we explore how neuroinclusive principles intersect with housing success. After that, Mike will introduce scenarios 2, and if we have time, 3, which build upon scenario 1, and we'll work through them as groups. After that, we'll wrap up with advocacy planning, how we can take what we've learned and put it towards advocacy. For those of you who were here last webinar, where we talked about the neurodivergent advisory group, today we're really aiming to display to you how these kinds of consultations work. So that's why we had our icebreaker is really, that's really one of the strategies we do use within our neurodivergent advisory group. All right, I will pass it off to you, Mike.
Olga, do you want to share what do you think about tacos?
Tacos are definitely not sandwiches. Maybe if you wrap it up, you can call it a wrap, but like if it's a soft taco, but hard taco, definitely not a sandwich.
I think I agree with the comment earlier, because I don't see two slices. I like that. Um, and I imagine that maybe if I cut the bottom of the taco and I put it together, then I would make a sandwich that way. But I agree. I don't think that it's a sandwich. Needs its own category, right? Okay. Thank you for all the comments in the chat there. Uh, so as Margaret said, we want to do a quick recap of part 1 and part 2 in case you missed it, and to situate our project, inclusivity in housing, in all of this work. As we mentioned, we aim to facilitate knowledge exchange and conduct applied research to move neuro-inclusive housing solutions forward. And we are a collaboration with the Seneve Family Foundation. And the two connected pieces of knowledge exchange and applied research. So we're spotlighting good practices in Canada and abroad. We're gathering, sharing, synthesizing resources and tools, all with a neuro-inclusive lens. And we're connecting with people across the housing ecosystem, such as yourselves, and in doing so, looking for solutions and things that people are doing to achieve housing success. So in part one, we focused on terminology, so discussing the use of language around neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and neuroinclusion. Neurodiversity being the umbrella term of the human cognitive experience, neurodivergence as a neurocognitive difference that comes with different strengths and challenges. And in the housing world, neuroinclusion is to create systems and spaces that take into account neurodiversity and neurodivergence. We shared how people have differences in their language preferences, whether it's using first person language or identity first language. And we came to say that we think it's important to ask people and respect their language choices in this matter. We discussed the unique housing needs of neurodivergent people while recognizing that there are inequities in housing. We talked about building on elements for successful housing brought from a housing through an autism lens solutions lab that was a few years ago, and recognizing that housing is more than bricks and mortar. So things like community relationships, medical mental health, and financial stability are all important aspects of housing. And finally, leading into the need to work with and connect with many different people and roles in the housing ecosystem. And we feel that working together, having this shared understanding and approaching what we do from a neuroinclusive lens can be quite powerful in improving housing outcomes. In part two, we focused on a process, the building blocks of community-informed housing. We discussed the importance of lived experience, how it is expertise, and it is necessary to incorporate into our housing decisions and our housing plans. We gave examples on how we incorporated community voice into our work, and we divided it into three parts: setting the foundation, so doing things before. We have our advisory group. Encouraging meaningful involvement is the second part. So that's during our advisory group meetings, for example, and then ensuring impacts and making sure what we collect and converse and discuss is turned into something that's actionable for our project. We talked about spheres of influence you may have from the individual and personal levels, that micro level, to an organizational, that meso level, or a broad structural or policy level, so that larger macro level. We outlined a process that includes defining who has lived experience expertise in your work, and for us to our work. Identifying accessible and meaningful ways to engage them and provide some examples of that. Ensuring that feedback is integrated, recognizing and compensating for that expertise. And lastly, to commit to regular and ongoing engagement, so not a one-off type of consultation when we're involving community and incorporating community voice. We left you with this question. What is, so at the end of part two, we left you with this question. What is one step you can take to integrate lived experience into your work? So, we welcome you to share this in the chat, and we'll hold on to some of these ideas for now. As you think about it, and as we go through the rest of the webinar, we can think about how we can sort of action these steps. For now, we're going to move into how can we enhance neuroinclusivity in housing. Soft taco in quesadilla. I like that. Sorry, got distracted by the exciting chat there. So today we separated we separated this into three parts to enhancing neuroinclusivity in housing. So we've got reflect, ideate, and advocate. So reflecting on specifically today on what housing success means in the context of neuroinclusivity. Then we're going to be ideating on how we can help housing success be achieved for the people in our spheres of influence. And our three scenarios that we have are focused on that ideating piece. And then lastly, the advocate piece, working towards advocating for neuro-inclusive housing when we consider nonprofit housing organizations and service providers. So you'll notice that today we've got lots of questions, lots for you to kind of think about. And here's another one. So I'll give you a moment to think about this as well. What is housing success? And think about it on two levels. So what does it mean for you? And if you are within an organization, what does that mean for your organization? Um, and again, we'll kind of hold on to these ideas for now. Here's some examples that kind of help you think through that. These are all stock images from PowerPoint and examples for reflection. So is housing success to you or your organization, a completed building? Is it so the picture of the completed building, it's on the left there. There's a picture of keys in a door. Is it the moment that you hand over the keys to a tenant, right? There's a picture of an entire community of buildings. So is it a thriving urban space that is a housing success to you? There's a picture in the middle of a family, a group of people at a table. So is that housing success, that family that's living in harmony? There's a blueprint picture, architectural blueprint. So is that housing success for your organization? Is it a completed plan or completed project? Right. And then there's a picture that has a plant and lots of moving boxes in the background. Is it after the move-in, right? Do we consider that as housing success after people have moved in? And then broadly, is it all of these things, right? And thank you, Jade, in the chat there. Own keys, building community, having connections, and knowing them. So lots and lots of different elements there. So when we think about our work in neuro-inclusivity in housing, this is kind of how we've framed housing success. We think of it as long-term housing solutions that meets the needs and wants of autistic and neurodivergent people. We recognize that these wants and needs are individual and different for each person and community. So this means for us, housing success is quite broad. And while we can't tackle all of the issues all at once, we have an aim or a goal that is not just looking at one aspect of housing. So lots of reflection there, and let's move into ideating, and I'll pass it back to Margaret.
Thank you, Mike. So in this section, we really want to transition into an activity. So we want to explore the different housing scenarios through the lens of neuroinclusivity. So the word ideate really means to form an idea or concept, and that's what we're going to try and do. We're just going to try and generate some ideas, challenge our assumptions, and think critically about what housing success means in a neurodivergent housing scenario. So we'll go through 3 scenarios if we have time, and each one will build on another. So we'll start with housing success meets neuroinclusivity. Then we'll move to modify or start new. And then the third one, people, places, and things. Next slide, please, Mike. So Petal Housing is proud of the work that they've done at Lily Pads Apartments. They're a nonprofit housing provider, and their goal is not just to fill units, but to create a stable and supportive living environment for all of their residents. As a housing provider, they really care about their tenant well-being, and they want to make sure that their residents feel secure, comfortable, and supported in their homes. From their perspective, they're really successful. They have, they're really excited about tenant stability with high occupancy rates and tenant retention. They are very excited about this, and their team is celebrating, especially because they have a very diverse tenant base. So one of their tenants is Alex. Alex is an autistic adult in her 20s, and she's lived at LilyPad for just about half of a year, has paid rent on time, and follows all of the lease agreements. She's not raised any complaints, and on the surface, all seems good. Next slide, please, Mike. So it seems like things are going well from the housing provider's perspective, but Alex recently spoke to a friend about her housing experience, and it wasn't what we thought. When she spoke to a friend, she shared that she has been feeling isolated and overwhelmed in her new home. While the building is stable and well run, it hasn't quite met her needs as a neurodivergent person. She finds the constant noise throughout the day challenging, and even in her apartment, there is no dedicated quiet spaces that she can retreat to. The bright overhead lighting in common areas have become overwhelming, making it really hard for her to spend time in shared spaces. Social interactions with other tenants are also unpredictable, and this adds to her stress, even though she started to get to know a few people. So Petal Housing has a tenant support worker, and this is great, but all of the communication for this happens through a mobile app, and Alex finds this difficult and stressful to navigate. Next slide, please. So Alex's discomfort isn't visible to the housing provider because they haven't received any feedback from Alex. From what they know, occupancy and rent payment is all good, and they think that Alex is doing great. But Alex doesn't really think so. So we wanted to ask you to help us to solve this. Who has the lived experience expertise relevant to this scenario? Who decides what housing success means, and what steps can a nonprofit housing provider take towards neuroinclusivity? So you can speak out loud, you can raise your hand, or you can write in the chat. And I can read a few things from the chat. I do see that Sandy wrote in the chat that housing success is when the building is full and my application folders are full. Success stories of my tenants. So maybe we'll start with who has lived experience expertise relevant to this scenario? I will read the chat as well. Oh, Alex is what Andrea says. And Nicole did write, housing success also includes feeling safe and a feeling of autonomy. That's great. So who is deciding what housing success means in this scenario? Danielle wrote in the chat, they both decide on what housing success means. To the landlord, it's everything Sandy listed. To a resident, it's things that may not be apparent just by rent being paid or resident retention. Emily wrote nonprofit provider. Rebecca wrote, for decision on success, there is a miscommunication problem, different perspectives. Yeah, and this is particularly important to note because one of the issues within autism and neurodivergence is really that communication issue. So often in autism research, they'll call it the double empathy problem. And when a non-autistic person and an autistic person try and empathize with each other, they have trouble. They have trouble reading each other's communication. And that miscommunication happens both ways. So what kind of steps might we take? Nina wrote in the chat, housing success to me would mean that you are taking into consideration requirements for all tenants' accessibility. If you can see a disability, i.e. a wheelchair, they know to have wheelchair accessibility. However, for non-visual disabilities, it would be important to research, have communications with the tenants that live with these disabilities to see if their needs are being met. Teru says having different ways to communicate needs other than just through the app. And Sandy writes, what would be a better way? Question mark. So what steps might be a better way for communication? How do you usually communicate with your tenants?
I'll chime in a little bit here. The building that I'm in, maybe this is why the scenario came to light, is that it does come through a mobile app, and the mobile app also sends an email whenever there's any updates, at least in my building.
Thanks for sharing. I'll ask Sunny. Maybe Sunny doesn't want to speak. So Tara wrote in the
Hi.
chat. Oh, yes.
Hi. Sorry. I was trying to find the button to unmute myself and I was having a very tough time. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I wanted to let you guys know that I had an idea, and it has been touched upon in the chat group. And the unique thing about the strata meetings where I live currently is that we do have one every, let's say, so often. And I know various buildings might have a more or a less. And I just wanted to chime in on the remark with the lighting. I think those kind of things could be brought up in sort of like a neutral area where everyone's, kind of in the same space where they just want to accommodate each other. I know how expensive things can be to replace lighting, but you know, there's all sorts of new technology now where you can just add in dimmers, but I think you'd have to go through the landlord if those types of lightings are in common areas. That's all I wanted to say. Just more interaction with the tenants.
Yeah, thanks, Sunny. And that's a great kind of like idea to bring up is that there are many different ways, for example, with the lighting to think about. So if we weren't to put in dimmers or something else, there may be other ways of being able to dim the lighting or to think about how we can have that solution. So Tara wrote, and I'm assuming this is to the question, how do you usually communicate with tenants? Tara says face-to-face. Emily says ongoing check-ins. Rebecca says tenant surveys. We have an emergency line to report tenant issues. Andrea says be on site, sit in the community rooms and lobbies and chat. Danielle says, look towards your staff. Many neurodivergent people work in housing. Getting an understanding of your residents' needs may not be apparent. Like the lighting or inconvenient communication, this can be a difficult subject to navigate if you don't know the question to ask or the right way to go about it. Teru also wrote, and emails. Nicole wrote, asking the tenants their preferred way of communication, allowing space for one-to-one and group discussion. Whatever it is, we need to be creative to create space for individuals to share what works for them. Sandy wrote, I have a private Facebook group, chat/talk with tenants. Handouts. Andrea wrote, reliable staff on site building relationships and trust over time. Jade wrote, ask, and while gathering answers, be open to responding them. Thank you, everybody, for your active engagement. Is there anything that you would like to add to scenario 1? I think that's scenario 1. So we've seen from a traditional housing perspective that Alex's tenancy looks successful, but from her lived experience, these are real barriers that impact her well-being. So we had different ideas in the chat, which were all really great. And last week, we also talked about an approach that we could take for a situation like this through advisory committees. This was through defining who has lived experience expertise. So many people noted that Alex has lived experience expertise, and someone else even identified that many staff also in housing are neurodivergent themselves. So having people who may be neurodivergent tenants and those who might be facing sensory or social barriers. So it doesn't necessarily need to be Alex, it could be another neurodivergent staff as well, or many who come together. Then identify accessible ways to engage. And you all had such many different ways of engaging with your tenants, which seem to have be very accessible. So tenant feedback can be collected through multiple methods, as you all just displayed. Ensure that this feedback is integrated into decision-making. So when we use it to guide any kind of changes, and if we can't make those changes, so for example, if we can't put in dimming switches, or there is some sort of regulations that mean that we need to have that kind of lighting, then trying to communicate that in a way that is respectful and lets the people who are facing these challenges know that they are being heard and we are trying to address these issues. And then recognizing that lived experience. So really compensating people for their time and input in their advisory roles. So ways that we might compensate people are if they're a paid staff member, allowing them to use that time during work to be able to collect information from other tenants to be able to make that space more inclusive. Also committing to ongoing engagement. So making sure that this is happening on a regular basis and not just ad hoc. So I saw the idea of an emergency line, and that is wonderful. Like, I think that all housing providers should have emergency lines and systems. And it's probably not appropriate to talk about how I find the lighting overwhelming. And to use an emergency line for that. So is there a way to check in and how often we might do that? What strategies that we identified might make the biggest impact for Alex? So Sandy wrote in the chat, I'm just sending a questionnaire survey to my tenants about this topic. What does I look like? Sunny says maybe meeting in person might work the best for Alex. Yeah. So there are many different ways that we could approach this issue. And if one doesn't work, we can always try another. I think we can go to the next slide, Mike. So this scenario really highlights that important gap that it can be easy to think that housing success can be really measured on occupancy rates or tenant retention or even lease compliance. Somebody is choosing, or and I'm putting air quotes, choosing to live somewhere. But as we spoke about before, and as you all know, that it's a lot more complicated than that. Housing success is really long-term housing solutions that meet the wants and needs of all people. And like neurodivergent people, these wants and needs are really individual and different for each person and community. This really emphasizes the importance of lived experience expertise and how actively seeking and integrating feedback is really key to creating a truly inclusive housing environment. So the strategies that we've discussed, defining lived experience expertise, collecting feedback in different ways, and ensuring ongoing engagement are all actionable steps that work towards neuro-inclusive housing. So well done. And I'll ask Mike to continue.
So we wanted to present scenario 2 and 3, just kind of get a gauge of whether you would like to do the scenarios together, all in the room here or in breakout rooms, or if you have no preference. So I'll ask Natika to do a little poll and we'll see where we land on this.
I'll just ask for about 30 seconds to share it, if that's okay.
Perfect.
And here we go. It should pop up on everyone's screen now. I'm seeing a heavier majority for doing it together.
Sounds like we're gonna do it together. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, we like to give like to go with the flow of where the attendees and audience feel like today. Okay, so here's scenario number 2. And the scenario number 2 is to modify or to start new. So Pedal Housing, our lovely nonprofit housing organization, has secured funding to improve accessibility and has a really big decision to make. They can modify an existing building to be more neuro-inclusive, or they have the option to invest in designing a new building with neuro-inclusion in mind. And obviously, we're presenting just 2 options here, and obviously organizations have multiple things that they need to consider, but let's just say these are the 2 decisions that they can make. We also know that Pedal Housing has a neurodivergent advisory committee with lived experience, and that they consult with them on a regular basis in their organization. Here's some general considerations, just to kind of round out the scenario and give you some things to think about. Our existing building is LilyPad, the one that Alex has been living in. LilyPad was built in 1990, so a while back, and meets current building codes, which is great, but probably can do some renovations. It has 150 units, 300 tenants, and the management team at the building has prioritized improvements to be made to the heating and cooling systems, the sound and temperature insulation of the building, common area paint and flooring, and then they would also like to do some landscaping and renovate the outdoor amenities. The new build is going to be called Dandelion. So land is available already. It's known for use. The housing organization has established, somewhat established partnerships and financing, understanding that there's always potential changes and risks there. Design work has not formally begun, but architects have been consulted. And the estimated timeline until occupancy is going to be about 7 years. There's a wait list for this building already, and this building expects to have 100 units. So let's talk a little bit about this. So the discussion questions here are, how can Petal Housing present these considerations to their neurodivergent advisory group? What are some important questions they should ask their neurodivergent advisory group? And lastly, outside the advisory group, who else can they connect with for lived experience expertise? Again, open it up in the chat or you can raise your hand. I think the first question, kind of thinking about how to present these considerations, one of the things that we learned that is quite important for advisory committees is to understand the thinking and the plans that the housing organization has. So if you were to package this information, how might you present it to your neurodivergent advisory group? If you have one currently, how do you present information and considerations that your organization has?
And so Sandy says in the chat, have a face-to-face meeting. What is considered to be neurodivergent? Question mark. Ask them how they like their building. Angie says, will the changes proposed meet the needs of the tenants? Outside of the advisory group, talk to the tenants, maybe the community. Tiffany writes, have a Q&A session. I wonder about this Q&A session. Would it be in person? Would it be online? Would it be all like synchronous or asynchronous, they call it? So Tiffany says in person, and Rebecca also says in person, and presenting visuals. Would there,
Yeah, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Margaret.
would there be specific like visuals that you think would be really helpful around this?
My thoughts exactly.
So sometimes like we had a picture of a blueprint on a previous slide. So sometimes having like pictures of what like a new renovation could look like. Rebecca also writes, summarize information, avoiding anxiety. Yeah, so sometimes people use things like infographics or posters. Yeah, graphics and prototypes, Rebecca writes. Sunny also writes, anonymous Q&A via online. What's the benefit of having it anonymous? So somebody wrote earlier in the chat, it's hard to know when there's people with invisible disabilities. And sometimes people choose not to disclose their disability. And so having it anonymous might allow for you to learn that, oh, maybe there are people with different disabilities that we weren't aware of, and we won't know who it is, but they do have specific needs that we need to consider in our modifications or new build. Jade wrote focus groups that include them, their supports possibly, the building, people, and a facilitator to have a real in-depth brainstorming session. Sunny wrote less anxiety to share. I think that was in response to Anonymous. Nicole writes, as for outside of advisory groups, look for groups that discuss noise pollution in community housing design, lighting options that are flexible, research how to allow space that can be changed easily and adapted to others' needs, such as moving walls, etc. Sandy also wrote, some people don't like to talk in groups.
Thank you. Yeah, so lots of different solutions and lots of different options. And I really think that the creativity of coming up with ways to gather that feedback, coming with different ways to present that information, and giving people time to digest the information and come back to you with thoughts, I think is quite key. And to Nina's comment there, in anonymity, there is less pressure. They don't need to feel their answer is wrong or opposite to others, so for sure. And in the interest of time, I'll move ahead here. So this particular scenario was really intended to help us think about different ways to provide information to a neurodivergent advisory group, and many were listed in the chat there. I think it helps us to think about ways to listen and address their concerns. And the last question about outside of the advisory committee, there's and we talked about this before in scenario one, lived experience expertise by neurodivergent people in other roles. So if they're in the housing world, perhaps they are neurodivergent architects or interior designers. And that would also be beneficial to consult and talk with as you're trying to make this decision. And so in the last, I don't think we have time to go through scenario 3, but what I'll do is I'll present it anyways. I'll present you with the questions, and then I'll let Margaret talk about the advocacy piece. So scenario 3 was sort of a continuation of this. 1 and 2, we were talking about people, places, and things. And Petal Housing has built Dandelion. It's a new developing neighborhood. And we have Jordan here. Jordan is in their 50s. They are neurodivergent and have ADHD. They have been living in Dandelion for about a year. And they're looking for social spaces, educational resources, and opportunities for physical activity. And they're excited to learn that there's a new nonprofit service provider, the Mango Center, and the Mango Center is now working with their community and their neighborhood. So the Mango Center recently started working with neurodivergent people in the new neighborhood where Dandelion is. They understand the importance of community connection and its importance to housing success. They've talked to and contacted the local community center, the library, learn what's available there. They've learned that there are fitness classes. So the image of a computer with a yoga mat and weights, and an image of a library space. And the library space has lots of room and has access to technology. So for this particular scenario, we had wanted to discuss some of the strategies that the Mango Center could use to incorporate community voice into what they're trying to do now, ensuring that impact piece and looking at what other places they can connect with to build that capacity for neuroinclusion at the neighborhood community level. And so we would have talked about how service providers can also foster that community connection and recognize the different people and the places that contribute to successful housing. And then this is why I wanted to present this scenario, because it leads into Margaret's talk about building capacity for neuroinclusivity by an advocacy process.
Thank you, Mike. So activism and advocacy are about having your voice heard and sparking social change. So we wanted to spend the last 10 minutes to really talk about how to use this approach to be able to spark social change towards neuroinclusive housing. So the terms advocacy and activism are often used interchangeably, but they have slightly different meanings. Advocacy aims to address specific issues through engagement with decision makers, and advocates often speak on behalf of others or themselves to encourage social change and reform. In general, activism aims towards overall social change, and an activist is someone who takes intentional action to bring about social and political change. So both of these play crucial roles in advancing neuroinclusive housing. Advocacy working within the system to influence policy and service delivery, and activism challenging the system to create broader social change. Next slide, please, Mike. So we'd like to talk to you about advocacy planning, because in a world that the needs of autistic adults and neurodivergent people, where their needs are overlooked, we may need to do some advocacy to make housing more neuroinclusive. So an advocate for neuroinclusive housing could engage with housing providers, policymakers, and funding bodies, and push for policy reforms and accessible improvements to ensure affordable, accessible, and supportive housing for neurodivergent people. So we've given a few examples on the slide. The first is a housing provider policy advisor with lived experience works with a municipal government to revise housing regulations. They may advocate for sensory-friendly designs in housing developments, and they may help to secure funding for support services for neurodivergent residents. We recognize that advocacy can take many forms, and many of you are already doing this. It can be individual action to systemic change, and every effort brings us closer to housing that works for everyone. Next slide, please, Mike. So we want to also recognize that everybody here has different capacities, expertise, and approaches to advocacy. So rather than prescribing one path, we just want to highlight different ways that advocacy for neuroinclusive housing can take shape. At its core, advocacy is about taking action to create change, whether it's individual, community, or policy level. So we've created this flexible framework for you to think about advocacy planning. Next slide, please, Mike. So in the first step, we would identify our role in the housing ecosystem. So you might have multiple roles and be able to advocate in different areas. Each role offers a unique opportunity for impact. Our role, for example, as a research and knowledge hub, really works towards bringing evidence and lived experience into housing conversations. In step 2, we have outlined that you would determine your sphere of influence. So in this step, you would consider who you might engage with that really helps to shape housing decisions. Think about housing organizations, advocacy groups, policy makers, funders, community groups, or even tenants like we talked about earlier. So neuroinclusivity in housing, our sphere of influence really includes housing organizations and advocacy groups, where we help to shape discussions around neuroinclusive housing and policy. Next slide, please, Mike. So now that we've identified our roles and our spheres of influence, our next step is really to think about what we would want to do and achieve and how we might move forward. In step 3, we want to choose one goal that we want to achieve. This is through identifying a specific change that you would like to see in neuro-inclusive housing. So you might consider whether your goal is at the micro, meso, or macro level, which we discussed last week. So the micro level would be really thinking about those direct impacts on individuals, such as through supporting tenants in accessible accommodations. So we might just help Alex with their one unit in that situation. In the meso, we may think about organizational or community level change. So working with a housing provider to integrate sensory friendly design across the building itself. And at a macro level, we might look at systems and policy change. So this would be advocating for policy for reforms in housing regulations. For our project, our goal has been sharing good practices in neuro-inclusive housing, really trying to ensure that lived experience informs housing policy and design. This is a meso goal and on the organizational and community level, but we also blend into macro as we try and influence policy. The next step, step 4, is really to map out your next steps. And I'm sure many of you have done a SWOT analysis in the past. So thinking about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that you can consider. So you might consider what skills, networks, and resources that you have to support your goal, the challenges that you might face, and what you need to do to succeed. Advocacy is really strategic, and the small actions that you take can lead to big changes, even if it feels like you're climbing a mountain. And so by identifying a goal and considering your path forward, we can each contribute to making neuro-inclusive housing a reality. Next slide, please, Mike. So this really brings us to our 5th step, sharing and committing to action. So I don't know if you've heard that accountability strategy where you tell other people what you're going to do to be able to actually try and achieve it. And this is really what we're trying to do today. So this webinar isn't just about learning, it's also about being part of advocacy. So by being here today, you're already contributing to a movement towards neuro-inclusive housing. So we want to thank you for engaging in this conversation and being part of our work. Advocacy does take many forms. And today, by listening, reflecting, and really actively engaging, you are helping us move neuro-inclusive housing forward. We also want to extend our gratitude to BC and PHA for their support in making this conversation possible. Natka, thank you so much for helping us to organize this. Your leadership in this has helped to shape a space where neuro-inclusivity can really be prioritized in many different areas. So we hope that the knowledge, examples, reflections, and strategies shared today and in the other 2 webinars really empower you to incorporate community voice and lived experience expertise into your own work. The next step is up to all of us and taking what we've discussed, putting it into action.
Amazing. Thank you.
I just wanted to, sorry. Okay, I just want to quickly, I don't think we have a whole lot of time for questions and answers. But again, thank you so much for this. And be sure to contact us if you want to talk further about neuroinclusivity and neuroinclusion housing. You can email us ni-house@carleton.ca and visit our website for more on neuroinclusivity and housing at nihouse.ca.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mike and Margaret. And sorry for interrupting you earlier.
No.
I just wanted to once again thank you both for coming here, sharing your expertise. For those of us who don't know, originally Mike and Margaret were intending to present at the HCC last year, and we were able to convert that opportunity and help share their expertise through this platform. So I would, in the post-session email that we sent to you, I would really like to encourage everybody to share any feedback or comments that they may have. Help us improve, help us generate more ideas around neuroinclusivity in housing and what else you'd like to see, because we would truly love to bring more of that knowledge and share it with everybody. So yes, with that, thank you so much for everybody's engagement and participation. We hope you have a great rest of your week, and we will be reaching out with the recording and potentially some more fun questions for everybody. So thanks again for joining us. Stay safe and have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Natka.